The marble floors of the towering office building gleamed as James quietly mopped the lobby, his old shoes squeaking with every careful step. Most people barely noticed him, just another janitor trying to make it through the night shift. But that morning, everything changed when the company's billionaire CEO, Richard Sloan, walked in with his expensive suit and arrogant grin. He stopped, looked James up and down, and made a cruel joke loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter from nearby employees echoed through the hall, but James didn't say a word. He simply nodded, his calm eyes hiding something no one in that room could ever guess. What the CEO didn't know was that behind James's quiet nature and worn-out uniform lay a story far greater than anyone imagined. A story that connected him to power, loyalty, and a truth that money could never buy. When Richard demanded that James clean his private office, the billionaire noticed something strange, a tattoo on James's wrist. It was small but unmistakable, and Richard froze the moment he saw it. That single mark carried a secret, one that could turn the entire room silent and make even a billionaire question everything he thought he knew. Who really was this janitor? Why did that tattoo make the CEO's face turn pale? Stay tuned, because what happens next will prove that respect can't be bought, and appearances can be more deceptive than gold. The room fell silent for a moment, the air thick with confusion. Richard's confident smile faded as his eyes stayed locked on that small tattoo. It wasn't just any mark, it was a rare emblem, a design once known only among a secret group of entrepreneurs who had built an empire decades ago. No one outside that circle was ever supposed to wear it. Slowly, Richard tried to shake off his unease, forcing a laugh and brushing past James as if nothing had happened. But his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. James continued cleaning quietly, yet every motion seemed deliberate. The security guard watching nearby noticed that the billionaire, usually loud and commanding, now seemed distracted, almost nervous. Word spread through the staff that something strange had happened in the CEO's office. Some whispered that the janitor wasn't really who he seemed, that maybe he once worked with the people who helped build Sloan Enterprises before it became a billion-dollar company. Later that evening, as most employees left, Richard couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head. He opened his old company files, searching for faces and names long forgotten. And then he found a photo from 20 years ago. Standing right beside the founders was a younger version of the man mopping his floor earlier that day. The caption underneath read, "James Carter, co-founder and lead engineer." Richard's throat tightened. If that was true, then why had a man like him returned? As a janitor, Richard sat alone in his glass-walled office, the city lights flickering beneath him. His mind raced with questions. If James Carter was truly the co-founder of Sloan Enterprises, why had his name disappeared from every record? Why was he back, quietly pushing a mop instead of sitting in a boardroom? He couldn't tell anyone what he'd discovered, not yet. His company's image was built on a clean history, and this truth could shake everything. Meanwhile, down in the janitor's room, James sat on a small wooden bench, staring at the same tattoo that had given him away. He had hidden that part of his life for years, letting others believe he was just a man trying to survive. He didn't hate Richard, he pitied him. The CEO had inherited everything, the power, the money, the company, but not the lessons that built it. James had walked away long ago after a betrayal that had cost him both his position and his faith in people he once called friends. The next morning, tension filled the office. Richard called an emergency meeting with the board, pretending it was about upcoming mergers. But his real motive was to find out who else knew the truth. At the same time, a young intern named Mia had overheard fragments of the conversation between the two men. Curious, she began digging into old archives, unaware that her curiosity might expose secrets both men wanted buried. And as the hours passed, it became clear the past was far from over. By the end of the week, the entire building buzzed with quiet rumors. Something about the janitor and the CEO didn't add up. Richard tried to act normal during meetings, but every time he caught sight of James walking past with his mop and calm eyes, a wave of unease hit him. He couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, and the guilt of something long buried began to rise to the surface. Old memories flooded back, late nights in a small garage, where two men built the foundation of what would become Sloan Enterprises. Back then, they were equals. Until greed entered the room. James had never forgotten that night, the day his signature was forged and his shares were quietly erased. He could have fought back, but he chose silence. Now, fate had brought him face to face with the man who had built his fortune on stolen work. Still, he wasn't there for revenge. He was waiting for something, or someone. Meanwhile, Mia's curiosity had turned into discovery. Deep in the company archives, she found old blueprints, patents, and letters signed by both James Carter and Richard Sloan. The timestamps didn't lie. She realized the janitor had once owned half the company. Heart pounding, she printed the documents and rushed toward the executive floor. But as she stepped out of the elevator, she froze. The two men were already facing each other in Richard's office. The door closed behind her. The air felt heavy. What was about to unfold would change everything. Mia's hand trembled as she held the stack of papers. Richard turned sharply, startled to see her standing there, while James simply looked up, calm as ever. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mia quietly placed the documents on the table. "I think you both need to see this," she said, her voice low but firm. Richard's eyes widened when he saw the faded signatures, his and James's, side by side on the founding agreement of Sloan Enterprises. He looked up at James, guilt flashing across his face. "You kept everything," he whispered. But James shook his head. "No, Richard, you did. You kept what was never yours." Before Richard could respond, the door opened again, and an older man stepped in. It was the company's chairman, Mr. Hayes, who had been part of the original board. His expression was grave. "I was hoping this day wouldn't come," he said quietly. "But the truth was never buried as deep as you thought." He turned toward Mia. "Those papers are just a piece of it. The board already knows the rest." Richard's face drained of color. He suddenly realized that the meeting he had called earlier, the one he thought was about mergers, had been turned against him. The board had reopened an internal investigation, and James's reappearance wasn't an accident at all. It was planned. James had come back not for revenge, but for justice. And now, the walls of power Richard had built around himself were starting to crack. The tension in the office was thick enough to cut through. Richard stood frozen, the once confident billionaire now looking small in front of the man he had wronged. James didn't raise his voice or demand anything. He simply stepped closer and placed the original company seal on the table, the very proof that he had co-founded Sloan Enterprises. The silence stretched as Mr. Hayes turned toward Richard. "We verified everything," he said firmly. "James Carter's name will be reinstated as effective immediately." Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. Years of pride and deception had caught up to him. He looked at James, almost pleading, but James only said, "I didn't come to destroy you, Richard. I came to remind you where this all began and what it cost." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the city outside. Then, to everyone's shock, James handed over a resignation letter. "I don't want the company back," he said quietly. "I want peace." But as James turned to leave, Mia stopped him. "There's one more thing," she said, handing him a file she had found in the archives. Inside was a signed letter from years ago, a confession from another board member revealing that it wasn't Richard who erased James's name. It was Mr. Hayes. The room went silent again as Richard looked up, stunned. The man who had framed him all along now stood exposed. James slowly smiled, realizing the truth. Sometimes justice comes in waves no one expects. Mr. Hayes stood speechless as the truth hung heavy in the air. The man who had silently manipulated both founders finally faced his downfall. Richard stared at him in disbelief, realizing that all these years of guilt and bitterness were built on a lie. James simply nodded, as if everything had finally come full circle. "You see, Richard," he said softly, "sometimes life doesn't need revenge. It just needs the truth to surface." Security escorted Mr. Hayes out while the board members looked on, stunned. Richard turned back to James, his voice unsteady. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. James smiled faintly. "Then start by leading with honesty. Build something worth leaving behind." For the first time in years, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He extended his hand, and after a pause, James shook it, a quiet truce between two men who had finally faced their past. Later that evening, as James walked out of the building for the last time, Mia caught up to him. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked out toward the city lights. "I'll keep cleaning," he said with a smile. "Not floors this time, but the parts of life that need it most." As the elevator doors closed behind him, Mia watched with quiet admiration. The janitor who once swept floors had cleaned up something far greater, the truth. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that real power lies in integrity, not wealth.